Hello again and welcome to ISAC Software Academy Linux course. In this lesson we will be covering networking in Linux, and there are various things to cover in that. As you can see, I found a rather cute little picture of all the various different distributions of Linux, and the idea behind this one is that they can all network together, and it's more of a social networking type of thing in this instance. However, what we will be covering is specifically hardware networking and software networking. Generally speaking, in Linux it's a fairly straightforward affair. This can, however, be a bit more complicated depending on what type of hardware you have or what type of network you have. And in the instance where it is a more complicated setup, it's generally still not too difficult, but it can add several layers of complexity the more difficult it becomes. Wireless configuration these days is fairly straightforward. However, in some instances, especially when you're using encryption on the wireless network, it can in fact make it very difficult to set up. Now, when setting up networking in Linux, it can be done both graphically and on the command line. Obviously, Linux being Linux, the command line has a great deal of tools available to it for networking, which is very different to the likes of a Windows environment, where in a Windows environment you would of course be dealing with pretty much just IP config and ping. In Linux there are quite a lot of tools, specifically to do with wireless configuration. There is a lot of tools available there, and it depends on what you want to actually use or what you're able to actually use with your hardware as to which is actually the best set of tools to use. As I've stated here, you will generally want to check the graphical interface tools first, as these tools are generally a lot simpler to actually use and implement. The command line, however, is always a good fallback. However, if you prefer, and there are many people who do prefer, you can go straight to the command line and configure it there. There are only a few instances where that sort of thing can actually be counterproductive. On certain Linux installations, the graphical interface takes precedence over anything on the command line, and as such can actually cause misconfigurations. So this is something to be mindful of. It's generally not something you have to worry about. It's more when it's a more complicated setup. However, it is something to keep in mind. Graphical tools can vary a great deal depending upon the distribution that you're using, and as such that is something that you might need to take into consideration if you're using different distributions on a regular basis. However, generally there is a tool that will automatically run on the taskbar so that you can see it. It's generally a fairly network looking icon. In the case of Ubuntu, it is two arrows in opposite directions, which doesn't scream networking but is quite common nonetheless as a networking icon. The type of network manager that you have in the graphical interface will limit you as far as your configuration options are concerned. This is something to keep in mind, as there are options available to replace the graphical network managers if you need to. Not all graphic managers are actually going to give you all of the same options, and as such, if there are no options available on your current network manager in your graphical interface, you may want to actually look at alternatives. Moving on to a more practical part of this, up here you can see the network icon. It is two arrows, as I mentioned previously. Single clicking on this with the left mouse button gives you a list here. Now obviously I have a wired network and it gives me the option to disconnect. It also gives me the option of auto Ethernet, which is automatic configuration, and I can also set up a VPN, which is a virtual private network, which is in effect an encrypted tunnel over a public network, so that you can act as though it's more of a local network. I have the option to disable network entirely right here. I have connection information and edit connections. We will be looking at connection information. Now here you can see that I have an Ethernet interface which is named ETH0. You may hear this also pronounced as Ethernet. Either way you go, it depends which school you went to as to how you pronounce it. The hardware address is the MAC address, so that's something to keep in mind. You may need to know that in some instances. The driver being used is the E1000 driver, as it's a gigabit connection. Keeping in mind this is entirely virtual, so it's not actually my real hardware address or anything like that, but the network that it connects to is in fact an 1000 megabit connection. Next up we have the IP addresses that are listed. Now in this instance I do not have any IPv6 addresses, so this makes this part fairly simplistic to actually explain. The IPv4 address here is the address of the system I'm presently using, and this is a private IP address, not a public one. There is the broadcast address for my network. Now this is because of the subnet mask here, and the default route, which is where everything gets sent, is the 10022 machine, and it has a primary DNS there as well, which is on a different subnet. Now all of this information is available. Obviously I have no security on this, but all of that's available through the graphical interface. Now we can also go in and edit connections. As you can see, it has the wired connection 1 listed here. You can have multiple connections. Linux has no problem with this. And also you can have wireless, mobile broadband, VPN, or DSL connections all listed here. In this instance I only have a wired connection, which apparently was used 2 minutes ago. So as you can see, I can go in and edit these details here, and there is the option for security. I can change this to pretty much anything I like here. I can in fact give it a manual IPv6 address and various other options. Moving on to the command line, there are a couple of commands that you should know. First and foremost is something that is very similar to the ipconfig tool available in Windows. This is called ifconfig, and it's short for interface configuration. As you can see there, the ifconfig command shows us the same information that we got from the graphical interface just here, with quite a bit more as well. It actually lists an IPv6 address. This is very similar to, as an example, the local loopback address here. It's not really the correct address because it hasn't been given to it by a DHCP server, but it's listed there anyway. It's very similar to a default IP address it's been given. The next tool that you would be familiar with from networking in a Windows environment is the ping tool, which in this instance will simply demonstrate it like so. Now you'll note that this will not stop at 4 pings. It will continue on until you hold down Control and hit C, and we'll give you at that point the statistics for it. Now if you want purely to give it a small number of pings just to test connectivity, you would add the -C and then a number. In this case we'll do 4 to make it similar to what you would be used to from a Windows environment, and you hit enter. As you can see, it will stop at 4 like that, and then give those same statistics again. Another thing to keep in mind with Linux networking is that you can in fact do something along the lines of this. Now there is several places named init. You want init.d. As you can see, it has a lot of things in it, but in this instance what we want is networking, and you can actually type in stop or potentially restart or start. Now, saying networking start will actually start up networking if it has been stopped or never started in the first place. Restart will actually stop it and start it again, which is quite useful should you lose the network for whatever reason. And stop can be used if you need to turn off all networking interfaces. I'll just demonstrate this quickly by saying stop, and it actually wants a sudo command first, so we do that. Now this is a common problem with the Unity interface. It actually really doesn't like it when networking stops. However, it has come back to life, so we can do it again and say start. And this is another problem with using this. It actually really doesn't like being used like this, even though that's the way it's designed to be used. So you can actually use another command. Now you can also, while this is down, check the if config, and you'll see that eth0 is down. Well, it's not even there in fact. Now this is something where you can actually go if config and put in eth0 and say up. This will not always work, and I don't think it will in this instance either. However, it has. In this instance though, it has not got an IP address. As you can see, it only has the IPv6 address, which as we know doesn't work. So what we can do in this instance is do a DH client, which will actually, perhaps not straight away, but it should go and pick up an IP address for that interface, which might take some time. Now I've just realized I actually need to do a DH client and specify an interface, as you can see there. Now if I do another if config, you can see it now has the appropriate IP address. A DH client is runnable as a foreground process, but prefers to be a daemon running in the background, and will actually continue to do so for that interface. Whenever the IP address lease is up, it will go and get it again. One of the downsides that you may note is that up in the taskbar here there is no network icon, and this has happened because we have stopped the networking process, and as a direct result the graphical networking interface is no longer able to speak to the networking subsystem and just stopped running. You can obviously run this again, as it runs every single time that the graphics starts up, and obviously that means it will run again when you reboot the system. There is also a suite of wireless tools that we will not go into a great deal of depth, but they are usually starting with IW, and that's the list of them there. And obviously if I do IW config, it is very similar to if config, but As you can see, there are no wireless extensions on this machine. However, these are the tools that you would use on the command line in order to set up a wireless network. You can also use WICD, which is spelt like that, WICD, and you can install it by simply doing, as I've stated before, the apt-get install, and you do WICD and WICD, I believe it's GTK, and it will go through and download and install these packages and will allow you to use the wireless interface in a graphical environment. As you can see, I want to be in the NetDev group, so it goes through and does the rest of it on its own, and once this is done, I can run this from up in the dash by simply typing in WICD. I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you.